There are new things in our Ko-fi shop this week. We have some original texture packs available for purchase to dress up your art, and we also have updates for our digital and traditional mediums master lists, walking through our favorite products and tips for making digital or traditional comics. These are free, but if you like what we do and want to support us, feel free to chip in a few dollars too. Both are available at ko-fi.com/screentonescast/shop. Thank you so much for your support and enjoy the episode.
Do it! Just do it! Don't let your dreams be dreams. Yesterday said tomorrow. So just do it! Make your dreams come true!
Hello and welcome to Screen Tones, where we talk anything and everything webcomics. Today we're going to be talking about writing a synopsis for your webcomic. I'm Miranda, I use she, her pronouns, and I make the webcomic Into the Swell.
And I am Ray, I use they, them pronouns, and I make the webcomics Overlord of Ravenfell and On Empyrean High.
And today we have a special guest joining us to share their expertise on synopses. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Alushi, or Ellie for short. I use she, they pronouns. I'm a scientist by day and a graphic novelist, artist, and science fiction fantasy author by night. I like to write about hidden monsters, lost magic, and sad robots. You can find a number of my works and anthologies online and in print, and currently I'm working on Key Space, a science fiction fantasy epic about an impossible space between portals that lead to different worlds.
Fantastic. So as many of you know, a synopsis is one of the most powerful tools we have for hooking potential readers into our story. But sometimes summing up your big ideas into an understandable, compelling short statement is really challenging. So we're here today to break down the elements, look into what you do and don't need, and hopefully give you some good ideas to work with. Before we really dive in, we want to clarify our use of the word synopsis. Industry standard views a synopsis as a full summary of your work from beginning to end. A synopsis can also be a smaller blurb that gives a summary without spoiling the whole story, similar to what you see on book covers and like dust jackets and whatnot. And it's this smaller definition that we'll be focusing on today. So to dive into the questions, first, how have the synopses you've written for your comics changed over the years? And what kind of uses have you found for them? And we're going to pass this question to Ellie to kick us off.
Yeah, the synopses have undergone some changes when I first started writing them. My writing process has been to, even from the very beginning of starting a comic, to try and capture the essential essence of the story. So a lot of the times when I first start investigating into an idea for a webcomic, I think a lot about how I can summarize it into a specific logline first. I find that that's a kind of a guiding star for me. Through the logline, once you kind of get a sense of the main character, the main conflict, and the setting, then you can kind of delve into the specific hooks that make your story special, not only to you, but to your potential audience. And so I usually use those aspects as a starting point first and develop that, write the entire story. Then I go back to the logline and the blurb/summary to try and see if I can condense down in a way that can be appealing to readers. So in that way, throughout the process of writing the stories, it can change from something that is relatively more straightforward to something that when you write through the story and start maybe perhaps storyboarding, that you find something that is very appealing that you want to include in your blurb or synopses. Mm-hmm. The kind of uses that I found for them can vary depending on what kind of audience I'm trying to reach. So for example, if I wanted to reach towards a more traditionally inclined editor or an agent, for example, then I sort of follow their blurb guidelines or synopsis guidelines, which tends to be a little bit more rigid. And I tend to use less of a kind of a funny or casual tone and try and inject more of my authorial voice into it. Whereas if I'm in a convention, talking to casual readers of science fiction and fantasy, I try to find genre-specific phrases and expressions to try and get them to feel a little bit of familiarity before going into the things that can be more hooky or intriguing or different about my webcomic. I find that depending on the situation, the audience, and realistically time of day. If I'm starting to be tired, then I actually just think about doing a funny list and try and do other things to make my synopsis a bit more appealing or different than something that they may have heard before.
That's I wouldn't have thought of time of day affecting how you're pitching it, but I can definitely see from like a con attendee perspective, by the end of the day, you've heard so many things that you're just like, I'm not going to remember anything you just told me. So finding a way to like make it more memorable when people have been hearing things all day is definitely important and not something I would have thought of. So that's such good tips. What about you, Ray? How have your synopses changed and how do you use them in your webcomic?
I find a lot lately that I've been considering more about the hypothetical reader and what they might find interesting about the story. And especially as I start branching out into different genres, I also feel like I need to address the expectations of the genre as well. Like tone matters a lot in that case, I feel like. And there's what place you're posting or saying your synopsis also matters. Like length isn't desirable in a lot of social media because people are just scrolling through and looking at the pretty pictures plus reading the blurb. And I do feel like the back of your book or say other journals or such like are a bit better for putting multiple paragraphs of your synopsis in there. As for what you're using them for, you can use them as a pitch, as a blurb, or just telling people what your comic is about at a convention booth. The difference is often who you're talking to and how much you can reveal. Like as a pitch, you want to spoil your story because the agent or publisher is not your story's audience, but they can connect you to your audience. And I personally also use these days, I have a master file that I have the entire story written as a synopsis, and then I edit from there several different lengths depending on where I'm posting it and pretty much who it's for as well.
Yeah, such a good idea. I feel like what you said about social media, with Twitter or I guess X, I don't know. It will always be Twitter to me, but like all of these social media that have such like short character limits, I feel like they've just made the public time or attention span so short. Like you have like a few seconds to grab someone's attention with what you're trying to pitch them, and that I think that's a huge use of these shorter blurbs and synopses. But yes, such good information and ways to use them. So let's go on to what do you think the elements are of an easy to understand or consume synopsis? And what are things that you 100% you definitely need these, and on the other hand, things that you definitely should not include? We'll go back to you for this to start off, Ellie.
Awesome. Yeah, so in terms of easy to understand synopsis, I find that the readers, when they approach something like the back of a book or on webtoons or scrolling, like you said, on social media, looking for something that may be inspiring, is to have a specific hook to your story. And sometimes that might be quite difficult for someone who is the creator to really identify it, because I think when a creator is so involved in their work from the beginning to the end, it's hard to really pinpoint the one specific thing that can capture an audience's attention, because you're so immersed into the characters and the arcs, the growth, the setting. Everything part of the story just becomes so interesting and crucial to making the story happen. So yeah, so one of the things that I find is talking to either your critique partners, beta readers, your more intimate group of readers and other creators who are more exposed to a wide variety of different webcomics, to find that one thing, that one sort of key ingredient that makes your comic very different from the rest of the others. So once you've found that, I find that if you can incorporate it into your synopsis through either the 140 character limitations, to even a full on 2 to 3 paragraphs that you've seen in the back of the webcomics turned graphic novels. If you have that front and center and as your guiding star, I find that the readers can really pick up on that and have it be super memorable when they're browsing through the bookstores, talking at conventions, or scrolling through social media. The other thing that I found very important is the orientation of the reader. So part of a good logline, pitch, blurb, and synopsis is for the readers to understand who the main characters are, what is the setting, and what is the main conflict that they're dealing with. In order for them to really put their care into it, that they start to become invested into the story, is also stakes. So why is the story important? Why are these characters doing this? If they don't fulfill what they aim to do, their goals, what happens to the world, or personally, what happens to them that is so critical for them to go on this journey. So I find personally that if you have the hook, you have the orientation, those tend to help the readers really get a very strong understanding of your story before jumping in and start flipping through the books and so forth.
100% agree. Like setting up the setting and everything of your comics is really important to me as a reader, but and definitely the hook. Finding that hook is such an important thing to include, because it's called a hook for a reason. What about you, Ray?
For me, it's pretty similar. You can't just go, here's my OC doing things and expect people to care, really. So giving them stakes, giving them motivations, while the setting is often a big part for me, I often don't like the synopses that pretty much just load a bunch of world building terms in there. So that's probably actually something I would at least say simplify a lot, because your reader's not going to care a lot for what all these new terms are until they actually get into the story. I do think you definitely at least need to reference the inciting incident, because characters are a good draw for a lot of people, but a lot of how they interact with the world and plot and everything falling apart is often what will draw people in. That's probably my main consideration on what you should consider your hook to be, but sometimes isn't always the best choice. It's really dependent on genre, your story, and your themes.
I 100% agree. Like, don't make your synopses a lore dump or all of the backstory of how your world came to be. That's not I mean, it might appeal to someone, but generally that's not a good method to take. What are your tips for someone who's struggling to describe their story in this condensed fashion? Because it's fairly easy to write out an outline of your story and everything that happens. But then you're left with probably pages at least of your summary, and that's a lot for someone to read. It's a lot harder to come up with this smaller bite size description of the story you're wanting to tell. So let's hear your guys' tips on how to do this if you're having a hard time with it. Going back to you, Ellie.
Awesome, thanks. If we can just quickly go back to what Ray said about, and what you've also mentioned about world building and the lore dump, is I absolutely agree in the sense that if your synopsis starts reading like every other word is a new word that the reader is not familiar with, or is something that is a conlaying term and so forth, then it actually detracts the readers away from the story. It really distracts the reader to try and figure out what the creator is trying to mean in terms of the context of the world, the story, the main character, what they're doing, what is the conflict, and so forth. So I definitely agree with that. The important thing, which part of the hook part of the writing a synopsis, is to condense that in a way that is palatable for the reader to understand. So if you want to say something like a specific name of a crystal, maybe instead of using the actual name itself, which might be super, super cool, but to say what the function of it is, or what it specifically looks like, that can hook the readers that way. Part of the reason that the readers can be disoriented or start to skim the story and so forth is that they just, they get lost. They don't quite understand where things are going. It starts to deviate from the expectations of not only what a core story is like, but also like what Ray said about genre conventions. They pick up something that's more of a mystery, but it starts to sound a bit more slice of life and supernatural, then perhaps that might be a genre niche, but it may be also that the readers start to think that maybe that is not for me. So that's something to particularly watch out for. So the diction, I sort of like as a technical thing to say, is very important for writing the synopsis.
It does feel very alienating when you're reading something and you don't understand half of the words, and it does not encourage you to go into the book further if you're already lost and you're just reading the back cover. So such a good point of like making sure you're using less specific to your novel terms and keeping them more generic, like using the function. That's a brilliant idea, because I feel like there's a lot of stories that have like this huge important thing that has a really cool name, but that means nothing to someone who isn't in the middle of your story.
Exactly. But also I find that if your synopsis is too general, that also gets the reader to also start skimming. I find personally every story has an audience. Every story, because the way that it is written in the perspective of every different creator, there's always a tidbit that makes it different. So if we all write the story of, say, like the Little Red Riding Hood, we might be focused on a different aspect of the characters, the wolf themselves, maybe the grammar, the setting, the way the themes work and weave throughout the story. And so I feel personally you have to find your writer slash creator voice, not only in the story itself, in the art itself, and the way that you present your story. So every story to me has a unique voice, and it's important to find what that is. And so you can avoid having your story, when you try and describe it to other people, to sound just like any other story.
Yeah.
And so avoiding things like the generalizations or kind of what we call like cliches, overused expressions when trying to describe your stories. It will really help a lot to give specific details that's relevant to your story, but
Yeah.
to tie it back, not so many specific and technical and so many proper pronouns that not proper pronouns, proper nouns that make the reader start to get confused. It's quite a balance.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and I think that's part of my issue with a lot of the recent books lately that have been using like fandom tags for their synopses, and it's just like confusing to me because you're distilling a unique story down to only its tags and trying to put forth this combination of tags as something that might be unique, but I feel like it just turns everything into something a little bit more generic. Tags are useful for sifting through on like a website because they're clickable. So I'm just kind of like, it should be to get you to a synopsis rather than being used as one itself.
Yeah, agreed. And it's almost, I don't want to say lazy, but because that sounds too harsh, but it's there are better ways to do it, and you can put a little more effort into beyond just picking out the tags from like fan fiction sites and TV tropes and whatever, and using them to get your point across. What other advice do you have for us, Ray?
All right. For advice, I would say I really think people are too terrified of spoilers when they're writing a synopsis, and I think that's probably just the spoiler culture in general is probably making it worse, but I do
Mm-hmm.
know a lot of authors that just feel like giving anything away other than their background stories for their OCs are pretty much ruining a lot how they're writing a lot about their stories. And they even consider the inciting incident of their story to be a spoiler, which I think is very detrimental because people want to
Oh,
see how things are falling apart. They're,
definitely.
the story is often them moving on or trying to get things back together afterwards, and I think that's a potential for a hook that a lot of people are leaving on the table. So
Mm-hmm.
I do think that they really need to reconsider what should be a spoiler and what shouldn't be a spoiler. And that can be a big mental block to get over, but I do think it's a necessary one. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so that's probably my main advice because it can feel really weird like giving it away, especially if your comic's not there yet, but it can actually genuinely get people interested and even keep reading.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that a lot of the times the creator holds all their key plot beats so close to their chest that they just start describing the characters or I guess their blurbles and then what their day-to-day life is, and you never get a sense of when did the story start happening. How can we make the other people, the audience, care about their potential growth? And it's hard to do that when you keep the spoilers and the main events of the story so close. And I guess that's one of the things I wanted to ask about to Miranda and Ray here. What do you consider to be a spoiler that is more of a hook and a spoiler that's more of a like a I guess in a way that ends the story and doesn't actually intrigue the readers any further?
Ray, if you have an answer, you go ahead. I have to think about this.
For me, I would say some of it is how early it happens. Because a lot of the spoilers I see that people keep close to their chest are the ones where the story actually starts. And sometimes, yes, it's surprising. Yes, it's like a twist, but sometimes that twist is what really makes your comic unique. And by not divulging that, it's pretty much everything that could make your comic stand out is being put behind a curtain. And I do think that sometimes like the mid-story spoilers can get kind of iffy on how much that the person might be like, "Oh, well, I don't need to actually read this." But sometimes it can be genuinely interesting. I think this is part of the thing that gets me is sometimes like the marketing department of a movie will put all the cool parts of the movie into the preview trailers, but
I
sometimes
hate.
those moments are genuinely a good hook. Other times it's
Mhm.
like, why even watch the movie? So that those ones I would say maybe get outside opinions on, because those can really be dependent. Now, a lot of the spoilers and plot twists at the end of a comic, I would say usually those are pretty good to be put behind the curtain, except for a pitch to a agency, because those are the surprises that often need a lot of build up to truly be the payoff. And the payoff is often something that you really need to have that history, but also you do want to still leave some surprises to your readers, in my opinion.
Mhm. Agreed. I like what you said about how soon it occurs in the story. Because I feel like if you probably should hold on to the spoilers that are at the very end, and like consider releasing to the wild the ones that are within the first few chapters. I think um another thing to consider is the like I'm kind of thinking like Beauty and the Beast as an example, because that's a story a lot of people are familiar with. But um, like if you find out I don't know, falls in love, but like if you're pitching it as like a romance or whatever at the beginning, you should probably include that yes, she falls in love like with the Beast, or like just leave it at that. But what happens beyond that point, like him breaking the spell like right at the last minute, like don't include that, because the falling in love is obvious, it's a romance, we know it's going to happen. And it okay, she falls in love with the Beast, that's the draw, but we don't need to know what happens beyond that because of falling in love. Or the real spoiler or twist of your story may be how something happens. So revealing the final point, but holding on to the way it gets there, like what the actual twisty road to that point is, maybe something to consider, because the end point could be a huge draw and may feel like a spoiler, but if your story gets these characters to that point in a completely different, unique way, that's, I mean, either way, like this is a really hard question.
I think you hit the point on the head though, both of you, because well, I just pitched the question because I think it's something that the readers might try and struggle to understand and appreciate what we're talking about. But it's exactly what you both have said. It's the journey to get there. Why is it so interesting? And how much setup is needed in order for that particular aspect, which might be a very strong payoff, in order for the readers to really anticipate, feel it, and really understand the importance of it. And so by saying it as a spoiler, you do kind of have to chance the risk of taking that reveal element away. And I think it's different for every story, like you said, like a romance versus like a mystery. Of course, in a mystery, if you say who has done the actual bad deed, perhaps that may or may not have been a great idea to spoil that right away for more mystery readers who want to be able to solve that story element themselves. But that being said, I think every story is quite different. And so I think each story has a different idea of a spoiler. And part of the things I find that may be helpful for writers struggling to write a synopsis is to have friends identify that for them too. So I rely personally a lot on my critique partners and beta readers to not only practice my pitch, but also to review the entirety of my work and see what jumps out as so memorable for them when they finish the story and what they think will be best to market the story. Those are some of the good beta questions that I personally find very valuable. And having a different person's perspective as a reader takes you out away from being too like putting all the parts of a story with so much attention on it, where you kind of become a little bit lost in the woods. Having someone else give you that sort of outside perspective is very helpful.
Mm-hmm. It's so invaluable in so many aspects of creating a webcomic and writing and whatnot in general, is having that outside perspective, because we do definitely get lost in our own comic so often.
And I would also say that since most webcomics are written serially, that one of the things to with them being serial is it's okay for your synopses to evolve. If you look at something and go, hey, a lot of people like this part, maybe I should actually include it in my synopsis after you get to that point, then that's completely valid, especially if you think maybe you should keep it close to your chest until this reveal happens, because the people that are following along with your story are going to have different expectations than someone that's coming into it new.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so 100% agree with that. Is it can evolve with you, especially in web comics. Typically, it's a very long process because you're releasing updates so spread out, or close together, but like a page at a time. Your synopsis can change, and you don't have to lock it into whatever it was at the very beginning. And I think, like Ray said, as you're revealing these extra story moments and plot, you can add them in because they may have been huge, valuable spoilers to hold on to, but now they're out in the world. You can include them in a way that will help continue to draw people in. Um, Definitely don't be afraid of that.
Yeah, exactly. That's a very good point about the serial nature of webcomics and having different synopses for each part of the story, especially as one kind of start to think about in print, or one thinks about how to divide the webcomic into different chapters, for example, and having sort of a chapter summary or chapter hook to try and intrigue the readers to continue on. And I really like how, Ray, you talked about the master list, because I also personally found that to be very useful, to not only have like your whole story / plot beats or an outline on one end of it, but also have your Twitter pitch or your Twitter synopsis, your back of the book synopsis, the synopsis that you want to just casually talk to your friends or at conventions about, and having a document that has all of these together will help you be more organized personally, but also save you a lot of time in order to just copy paste or to think about and share with people.
Yeah, overall, I do think that synopses are important in just condensing your story down into something that's concise. because it should actually get you thinking a lot on how it's structured too. So even if you're not planning on pitching to someone or posting it, I do definitely think that it is a useful exercise.
Yeah, and all of these examples should show that you're not going to have just one synopsis that fits all of the purposes that you might need. You'll definitely have multiple for each occasion, depending on your audience, depending on where you're posting it. So you have a lot of room to play around with different things and evolve and test out different things. If something, like if you try out one synopsis and you don't get a lot of hits or feedback or like readers from it, you can change it and take that and grow and adapt. Ellie mentioned at the very beginning of how they start with the log line and then expand on that. I think you can also go the opposite route of write out your long summary of what you think your comic's about, and then take that and start paring down from there. Like, even if it's something like just crossing out lines and figuring out the important things that you really want to include and want people to know about, that like kind of just making it as minimal as possible. Whatever direction works for you, whether you're going from small to big or big to small, I think both methods are valid. In my own opinion, if and from my own experience, if you really can't narrow down your story to a small blurb of like a few paragraphs or less, maybe reevaluate your story, because your story may be too convoluted to kind of convey it in a method. And I say that because in trying to outline and come up with my current comic I'm working on, I had this huge story that sounded so great. And then as I was trying to figure out how to describe it, I'm realizing that, okay, this is way too confusing and doesn't make sense. And I probably should reevaluate the story as a whole. So that can definitely be an indicator if you're really, really struggling and absolutely cannot figure out a way to get a good synopsis.
That's a very good point. Yeah. It's just fascinating to me that there are so many different methods and so many approaches to writing, to creating comics and so forth. I find personally even that when I approach a story, I might, like you said, approach it from a logline way, or even just sort of hammer out a first draft and then decide what is actually important and then going back to it. And it changes for me for every story. And like you said, if I'm starting to try and condense a story in a way that can help readers orient themselves and be excited for the story, but really, really struggling to do that because there's just so many moving parts, it is very important to look at your beats, look at the main thesis and themes of the story. Are you trying to incorporate too much into this one medium? It may be, like you said, it may be too much. And not that the story itself is should be shelved, but more like perhaps the story needs to be broken apart into several different books or several different web comics that kind of intertwine later on and so forth. There's so many different ways of solving the issue. But yeah, one of the key things is to try and do a synopsis. And that's a good test to see if your story will appeal to the audience that you're going for.
Yeah. 100%.
Scope creep is definitely a thing that often happens.
Oh my gosh, it is.
So pruning all of that back can be very beneficial. And you don't have to throw away all those parts. Like Ellie said, you can turn them into other stories that intertwine with your main project.
Mm-hmm. I have heard of this and done it myself, of instead of deleting things, you just kind of keep them in like a scrap document. If you're like cutting out huge pages and paragraphs or whatever of your outline, just move them to somewhere else so you can go back, because like Ellie said, that it doesn't mean the story is bad. It might just need to be spread out and split up. So definitely save those ideas, but consider presenting them in a different way. All right. And in keeping it concise like a synopsis blurb, we are going to wrap up today's episode with a chicken Caesar salad wrap. Thank you so much for listening. I'm your host, Miranda, and you can check out my work at mirandacakes.art.
And I'm Ray, and you can check out my work at empyreancomic.com or Overlord of Ravenfell on Webtoon.
And thank you again for having me. I'm Ilushi, and you can find a condensed list of my works at eliushi-carrd.co, the card website, or you can just Google my name or my comic Keyspace, and hopefully you'll be able to find me.
And that's a wrap. We'll see you later, slappers. I feel like I'm not crispy enough to say that.
It works.
Thank you for listening to Screen Tones, a webcomic podcast. We are supported in part by the fantastic folks at Hiveworks, home of many amazing independent webcomics. Check out their store at hivemill.com to find ebooks and print books of many fine Hiveworks titles. We're also supported by, well, listeners like you over on Ko-fi. Drop us a few bucks if you enjoy what we do and want to help us continue talking about anything and everything webcomics. And don't forget to give us a follow on Blue Sky and Tumblr so you don't miss an episode. You can find links to all of those at screentonescast.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.